Thank you, Corwin. Thank you. Yeah, I give this talk like with a lot of humility, right? Some of you guys are graduate mentors. And, obviously there's more than one way to mentor students. And what works for me won't work for somebody else and vice versa. So, these are some suggestions and some thoughts that, I've kind of developed over the years. And like Corwin mentioned, I won the Casida Award. Lester Casida was one of the foundational scientists for animal reproduction in the United States and was a great advocate of graduate education. So I won the Casida Award for graduate education. And among other things, you have to give a talk on graduate mentoring. So this talk today is not that talk, but kind of the ideas are the same. And I start off with this picture of Ed Hauser, who was a professor at University of Wisconsin. He was my graduate mentor and a big inspiration for me as a scientist. And a lot of the ideas that I've developed in terms of graduate mentoring, I'm sure are based on things that I learned from him and like I'll talk about from others. So I'm going to start off trying to advance the slide. I'm going to start off with this quote from Ben Meffam, who is a lactational biologist, or he was a lactational biologist at University of Nottingham, because I think this quote really addresses a fundamental aspect of education of a scientist. So he said, this is back in 1987, a criticism of much science teaching is it places too high a priority on information transfer and thereby engenders an uncritical attitude of the part of students. Students feel there are so many facts which need to be learned. There's no time for questioning, no room for skepticism. But the distinctive feature of scientific knowledge is its impermanence. Few practicing scientists today will not have had to modify their opinions quite substantially over, say, the last 10 years. So in short, science is not simply a body of facts, but an activity. And then he said, while we may derive a certain amusement from the apparent naivete of our predecessors, we should forbear derision. Our own views will doubtless suffer a similar fate, right? So that's what I think we have to do in graduate school, learn the practice of science, not learn everything there is to know about the endocrine system or everything there is to know about feeding a cow, but learning how to do the practice of science. And there's lots of different ways to do that. So I'm going to start off this seminar by giving some personal reminiscences of my own education as a graduate student from Ed Hauser. This is Dr. Hauser talking to a bunch of beef producers in Wisconsin and convincing him that the Angus Holstein cross was the way of the future. So he taught me how to be a scientist. And how did he do that? I've thought about this. The first thing he did was give me an intellectual framework for how to do science. Right? We didn't just go into the lab and kind of learn how to do science by trial and error. We were taught a series of principles for how to do science based on the scientific method, hypothesis testing, designing unbiased experiments, statistical analysis of data. And in fact, that was a very common way of educating graduate students at Wisconsin at the time, because Lester Casida, the Casida Award was named after, had just retired when I got there in 1978. And his thinking dominated the whole department. And in fact, all of animal reproduction in the United States was heavily influenced by Casida's ideas on the theory of science, not on what the role of estrogen is, but on how to do science. And Hauser taught us that deliberately. And then he also let me design my own experiments, like over and over and over. And I'm pretty sure I always ended up doing the exact experiment he wanted me to do. But I always designed it. And if there were flaws in it, he'd correct the flaws, I go back, and back to him again. So I got lots of experience designing experiments. And of course, a lot of self-confidence came from that. So another feature about Ed Hauser, he was very dismissive of dogma. I see I spelled authority wrong. He was dismissive of dogma, authority, expert opinion. And he claimed, in fact, he lived his life this way, not to care what others thought of him, but only to know that he lived his life true to his own ideals. So as long as he did that, he didn't care what the American Society of Animal Science thought about his research or his colleagues thought about what he was doing. As long as he felt he was acting in the right way, thinking in the right way, he was satisfied. But he was a great disciple of Ayn Rand, the philosopher. Not sure if anybody has read her, but when I was a grad student, I read Ayn Rand because Hauser was always talking about her. And another thing that, for me was a real inspiration. We always were taught to view science in terms of what it would do for our ability to understand biology, for our ability to improve animal production, never for, well, this will get us famous, or this will get us a grant, or we'll be able to publish in a good journal, or I'll get ahead from my colleagues. It was always about the science. And one of his quotes was always, let's ask the cow how it works, instead of, relying on some expert's opinion. So, I learned all those things when I was his grad student. And as I mentioned, Wisconsin in those days was really imbued with the doctrine of Lester Casida. And Hauser, even though he was never a grad student at Casida's, was really somebody who drank deep from the Casida well. There's Lester Casida in 1947. There's Alvin Warnick. Some of you know him, who was a longtime faculty member here, but he was a grad student at Casida's. Casida had 64 PhD students in animal reproduction. So at one time, just about every animal science department in the country had a Casida student. And this is a document that you can't read probably, that Casida wrote about how to interpret a scientific paper. So I put this up here to show how, we were taught the theory of science, not just the theory of endocrinology or the theory of physiology. And there's lots of interesting ideas in this little 2-page mimeograph. So one of the things, I got this my first week in grad school. And one of the things I remember, to this day, is this example of reasoning after the fact. We were always told, don't reason after the fact. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, here's what you mean. If you go down the road visiting 1,000 dairy herds, and you come to a farm in which 100% of the calves were heifers, a statistical test would undoubtedly indicate a deviation from the usual that's highly infrequent. If your enthusiasm leads you to try to explain the cause, you may notice that the wash water from the housewife's laundry drains out across the corner of the cow pasture, and this water carries considerable detergent that the cattle like to drink. You then have an explanation for how to control the sex ratio. You have demonstrated reasoning after the fact. You have put together 2 interesting observations. You have not, however, tested a hypothesis. The test of significance was worthless, right? Because you're deciding afterwards what caused the phenomenon, not doing an experiment and see if the phenomenon can be reproduced. So, this just gives you an example of how we were encouraged to think about the doing of science. And I'd encourage anybody to read this paper from 1966 by Lester Casida about graduate education. The things he said that are important back then are still important. To understand the principles of the science that you're studying. Casida had a reputation as hating scientific techniques, but you can see his number 2 point was mastering the techniques for gaining new information, coupled with how to develop and learn new techniques. And then number 3, which I think is often lacking in graduate students' education, is a philosophy of research. You know, how do you approach the acquisition of knowledge through experimentation? So that's what his mimeograph was doing. So when I left Wisconsin, I did a postdoc here at Florida, and then I got a job at the vet school. And I was pretty convinced that I was ready to mentor grad students, because I've been thinking about it all during grad school. I'd seen it in action. And this was the first cohort of my grad students back in 1985. And one of the things I learned pretty quickly was I was not really completely ready to mentor graduate students. I was 28 years old. Some of my students were older than me. And one of the first things I had to learn was my students were not little versions of me. They didn't have the same motivation. They didn't have the same interests. They didn't have the same goals. Each one of them were individuals, and each one of them were in grad school for their own reasons, which were not necessarily the same reasons as I went to grad school. So once I learned that, that helped me a lot. So that's kind of indicated in this cartoon, right? The plan you tell your advisor, I'm going to be a professor at a major research university. Your real plan, I got to find an alternative career. Secret plan, I'm going to become a baker or a rock star or a writer. That can cause some problems if you think your student is this, but they're actually this. So my first piece of advice is learn how to be a good major professor. You know, think about it, just like you think about how to be a good experimentalist or how to be good in the lab. Think about how to be a good major professor. You know, have a plan for how you're going to lead your students in their own education, and tailor it and refine it in general and for each specific student, because everybody's different. And, you know, practice it. Just like this little kid is not going to become a piano virtuoso just by paying more money to the teacher. You're not going to become a great graduate mentor just instantly. And try different things. Some things will work, some things won't work. And you know what works for me, not going to work for John Arlington, or what works for Jose, not going to work for me, because we're different people. So everybody's got to figure out for themselves, you know, how they can best serve their own grad students. And, you know, by doing that, you're serving yourself. And, you know, I'm a great, like, people observer. I like people, and I like to watch people, see how they do things good, how they do things bad. I like history, so I like to even read about dead people, how they did things. And I try to incorporate those lessons into my own career, my own life. So one of the great mentors for me after I came to Florida was Bill Thatcher, because I was having trouble trying to figure out how to motivate my students, how to educate them in the way that I thought they needed to be. And I used to go to Bill, and he used to give me a lot of very good advice. Much different personality than me. In some ways, we're probably very similar in terms of how we view our graduate students, but in some ways quite different. But he taught me a lot. And, you know, Bill was like tough with his students, but he was loved. Yeah, this is Eric Schmidt kissing him on the head after he got his PhD. Who's this? Dr. Benelli. When he was still Mr. Benelli. And even 30 years later, that affection remained. One of the things Bill taught me that actually was very helpful was you don't need your graduate students to all become outstanding, earth-shattering research scientists. They don't all need to be you. All you need to do is help each one of your students reach their full potential, whatever that is. If you do that, you're a success. They don't have to publish a paper in science. If they're able to be as good as they can be and be prepared for whatever they want to do after they leave you, then you've done a good job. And Bill's told me that many times. And like I told you, I like to read history. So one of the things I read is history of scientists. This is from a biography of C.R. Henderson, who was one of the foundational animal geneticists in the 20th century. And he gave a lecture at Kyoto University in 1985. And these were the 7 pieces of advice he had for grad students. Study methods of your predecessors, work hard. Everybody says that. Do not fear to try new ideas. That is not so common. Discuss your ideas with others freely. Also not common. Because you don't want people to criticize your idea, or you think they're going to steal your idea. But you'd be better off. Your ideas will get better if you share them with others. Be quick to admit errors. I know some people who never admit their ideas wrong. They just keep plunging away at it. But, we're all, I don't think most of us have inherent insight into what's true and what's not. So we all make lots of errors. Always be optimistic and enjoy your scientific work. It can be a great joy. So my second piece of advice, and this is probably the most important, is I don't care what your attitude is towards science or towards, buy into your students, every one of them, the ones you like, the ones you don't like, invest in them, give them your time, the resources needed so they can succeed. Your success, your satisfaction depends on their success. If they're not successful, you're not going to be successful. If they're unhappy, your lab's going to be unhappy, you're going to be unhappy. So, do what it takes to have your students succeed. I know so many faculty who never read their students' papers, never read their thesis. They should not be mentoring grad students. Get to know each one of your students because they're all different, right? And they all have, among other things, their own goals. If you know what their goals are, you can help them achieve them and you can help them achieve your goals. And, like I don't know how many faculty I've heard saying like, you need to come in Saturday, I need to get that grant. Or, we need to get a paper out. I need 1 paper a year. I'm not going to get tenure. Students don't go to grad school so you can get a grant or so that you can get a paper. That's not how you motivate them. Practice what you preach. That's pretty obvious. Don't say you have to be in here every day and then never come in. And, be loyal to them because you want them to be loyal to you. It's a two-way street. So, this is a true story that was, really drove it home to me. I chose a new grad student, or she chose me, Paula Tribolo from Argentina. And before she came to Gainesville, her father, who's a veterinarian in Cordoba, Argentina, Ricardo Tribolo, he invited me to give a seminar down in Cordoba. And after the seminar, I went to his house. So that's Paula's father and her mother, and that's her brother. And so I was there, and, I don't really speak very good Spanish, and they didn't really speak English, but Andres spoke Spanish and English. So as long as Andres was there, and then he would leave, we'd all So I thought, well, they don't understand English. And so as I was leaving, Ricardo walked me out, Andres walked me out, and I said to Andres, I said, tell your father, don't worry about Paula. I'll take care of Paula. And Ricardo said to me in English, like she was your daughter. So that made me realize, these grad students, they are somebody's son, they are somebody's daughter. They have their own goals, and they have trusted you to help them achieve those goals. So, don't screw it up. Keith Inskeep, he was another very famous reproductive physiologist, the graduate of Lester Cassida's program. And after he got hired at West Virginia, he asked Casida to come and evaluate their graduate program to see whether they had enough resources at West Virginia to educate doctoral students. And so Keith said to Casida, what do you think, Cass? Do we have what it takes? And Casida said, yes, Keith, but remember, or you must always remember, you're playing with people's lives. So, I think that's important to keep in mind when you're a major professor, that somebody's success in life they can survive a bad major professor, but it goes a lot easier if they have somebody who, buys into them. And another thing I'll say, I've had a lot of grad students who I thought were terrible. And then like midway through their program or at the end of their program, it's like the lights came on and they, excelled in grad school. And I realized, those early years, it just took time for them to figure out, what was involved with being a scientist. Charles Darwin, here's what his father told him when he pulled him out of school. You care for nothing but shooting, dogs, and rat catching, and you'll be a disgrace to yourself and your family. So, he was obviously wrong about that. So, don't give up on people who you think are struggling. A lot of them will figure it out. All right, I'm going to change my tone here a little bit. And just, I thought about what would be a perfect grad student? And later become a perfect scientist. What characteristics would they have? Because if you as a graduate mentor can promote these characteristics, you will have done a good job preparing a student for independent career. So I thought, these 7 characteristics, I'm sure you could think of others like brilliance. I don't have that in there anywhere. Brilliance is important, but my guess is most really good scientists aren't brilliant. They're smart, but they have these characteristics. Being a critical thinker, independent thinker, self-confident, thick-skinned, criticism rolls off them, they don't cry. Team player, laboratory wizard, and hard worker. So how can you as a mentor encourage all these things? How do you make people a critical thinker? Well, I think you practice it. Just like you become a good piano player by practicing critical thinking, getting people to read papers, and then quizzing them about the papers. We have lab meeting every week in our lab where we discuss the research literature. Not so much to find out what's the latest advance in a specific area, but what was their hypothesis? What was their design? Did they interpret the data correctly? Did they do the methods correctly? Just to practice critical thinking skills. How about an independent thinker? That's probably even harder than teaching people to be a critical thinker, because we all have an investment in certain ideas, right? Because we're funded to explore certain ideas. So how can you let your student think independently, develop their own ideas when they have to do something for the grant? I think you can do both. And, the biggest crime is where you refuse to let anybody in your lab believe anything except what you believe. what you think is true. And even when the data, and I know famous scientists who do this, even when the data is not consistent with the overall hypothesis, everybody's got to twist it into the existing hypothesis. That is not the way to develop independent thinking skills. Don't be afraid. Don't make your students afraid of interpreting data differently than you interpret it, or differently than the field interprets it. I think independent thinking is really important. How about self-confidence? There's all sorts of ways of looking at that. Self-confidence working in the lab, self-confidence as a scientist, challenge some senior scientist with his ideas. I love this picture. I'm pretty sure these three people never worked in a lab in their life before they came to my lab. And a year later, they were all happy as clams in the lab, because they developed the self-confidence to work in the lab. Like one thing, like I love science, okay? But there is a lot of pain associated with science, right? Your techniques don't work, your hypotheses are wrong, all your results are negative, your papers are rejected, your grants are turned down, you can't find a job. There's lots of things negative about science. So I don't think it helps when the major professor criticizes their students when their techniques don't work, their results are negative. You have to maintain a positive attitude in the lab. If a technique doesn't work, let's just try it again, or let's talk to somebody who's gotten it to work and figure out what we're doing wrong so it doesn't work. Or, if our experiment doesn't work, let's think about that. Let people develop the self-confidence to, face the world. It's another example of how science can be bad. Thomas Huxley was one of the leading scientists in the 19th century. He was a grandfather of Aldous Huxley, who wrote Brave New World. And he said, the great tragedy of science, the slaying of a beautiful hypothesis by an ugly fact. Right? That's very disappointing when your idea that you were sure is true isn't true. I looked for a slide to show thick-skinned, and all I could find was this superhero, shark skin. And he's getting hit by arrows, and they say, it doesn't stop him, doesn't even slow him down. That's why they call me shark skin. It hurts when your paper's rejected. It hurts when you give a seminar and somebody says, well, are you concerned that you don't have a control? That hurts. So, there's two responses to that. Avoid that hurt at all costs. Don't give seminars, don't write papers, or just develop the attitude that you're not, and it's hard. You're not going to take it personally. You're going to keep on going like this guy. If you can do that, I think you enter a new level of science. If you're not afraid to have your ideas criticized, you'll associate with people who criticize you, and they'll make you a better scientist. So Jim Watson, the guy who was one of the co-discoverers of the double helix, probably one of the most famous scientists of the 20th century. He wrote this paper, just a 2-page paper, in 1991, Succeeding in Science, Some Rules of Thumb. So there's a lot of things in here. He said to succeed in science, you have to avoid dumb people. Not very nice. The fact is, you must always turn to people who are brighter than yourself to go somewhere beyond your ability and come out on top. And he says, if you want to be a good basketball player and you play with bad basketball players, you're never going to become a good basketball player. But if you play with basketball players better than you, you're going to get better. And I think once you have a thick skin, you will go to a colleague like Bill Thatcher or Jose Santos who'll tell you what he really thinks. And you won't cry if he doesn't like it. You might not accept what he says, but you'll think about it and maybe reevaluate your own thoughts. So, I think thick skin is very important. And, just as an aside, we do that less and less. You go to a animal science meeting or a SSR meeting, people don't ask students hard questions. They don't want to hurt their feelings. But then all you're doing is letting that student screw up and not tell them about it. So that's not helping them. Team Player. It's one of my favorite movies. The Three Musketeers from the 1970s. One for all and all for one. Oliver Reed, like Porthos. Nobody knows this lady, Faye Dunaway, but she grew up in Mariana. Became a super famous actress in the 70s and 80s. I'm not going to talk a lot about Team Player, but I think it's so important as a major professor, as a graduate mentor, to develop that attitude where everybody in the lab helps everybody, and everybody in the lab can expect to be helped by everybody. So, that's this whole idea of loyalty. Do you trust your major professor? Do you trust your lab mates? Then you're going to have a team. But you can't just say, we have to work on cultivating loyalty, increase it by 30% or you're all fired. What about the lab? Reproductive biologists worry a lot about the lab, and they always have this debate with each other. What's more important, the ideas or the techniques? So I would say, they're both important. Keith Inskeep, who I keep quoting in this talk, he said scientists must guard against inventing problems to utilize existing techniques and develop the in-depth thinking that will allow our students to invent techniques to solve the problems. And, I agree with that. Lots of people are doing the same thing in the lab the year they retire as their last year in grad school. So why is that? I think it's because they don't have the self-confidence to work in the lab. So they're afraid to learn new techniques. They're afraid to incorporate new techniques. I think you should encourage your students to, do anything in the lab. Screw it up. Let's try it again. Learn to not be afraid of. I'm convinced a lot of students who we think that student never seems to get anything done. They're just afraid of failure. They don't want to get yelled at when the radioamino acid that cost $2,000 was done wrong. So they just don't do it. So you gotta, get them to build their self-confidence. And then I think learn the basis of what they're doing. I'm always asking my students, what's in PBS? Huh? Why do we use PBS? Why is it pH 7.4? Why is it 0.9% sodium chloride? All these little stupid questions, that's the basis of all the lab techniques we do. And once you can figure all that out, you don't even need to find some cookbook protocol for doing things. You can do it yourself because you can anticipate what are the requirements. So I think when you are totally unafraid of technique, then you can let your ideas drive what you want to do. If you're afraid to work in the lab, then you're limited in terms of the techniques you can work with. How about working hard? I go on Twitter a lot, and grad students are really on Twitter, and they are not happy for a lot of reasons. Probably a lot of good reasons, but they also want somebody like me to quit so they can get my job, and that's not going to happen. But they're always complaining, I have no life. I'm working. My fellow graduates are now all stockbrokers on Wall Street, and I'm up in the lab at 2 a.m. It is true. And something everybody has to figure out for themselves. How can I be as successful as I want to be and still have my own personal life? And if you're married, have kids, that's an even more complicated problem. But there's one like humorous slide. There's one of my students, Andrew Majeski, fell asleep on the lab bench. And he was so sound asleep, we could all run up and take pictures with him. He didn't wake up. So, I mean, you could say, Dr. Hansen, you're working that guy too hard. But so I don't have an answer to this, but I will say one thing. And it's based on something Jim Lauderdale told me. One of the guys I really admire. He developed Lutalice, the most widely used animal reproduction drug. And he told me one time, I used to think I was a really hard worker. That, I come in every night, I come in on Saturdays, I come in on Sundays. And I was very proud of myself that I could work hard. But then he got promoted and became a vice president. And after about 6 months, he realized, I'm not coming in at night anymore. I'm not coming in on weekends. I was never a hard worker. I just loved what I was doing. And once I didn't love what I was doing, I worked just like everybody else. And, I think when you're in grad school, if you hate to write, if you don't really like being in the lab, if you don't like going up and having people attack you, that's okay. Most people don't like that. But, maybe that's not the right career for them. So then, of course, your major professor is telling you to do those things 60, 80 hours a week. Doesn't sound very fun because you hate it. But I think if you like it, the hard work part is easier. And maybe it's not really hard work. Maybe it's just being selfish to the people around you. All right, I think this is my last idea. Henderson said science can be a joy. I think science is a joy, even though it has all the negative aspects I told you about. And as a leader of a lab, as a graduate mentor, major professor, try to foster some of that joy in the lab. Make the lab a fun place to work. Celebrate the little successes that occur in the lab, not just the big Nobel Prizes that come, but somebody got their assay to work, or some cow got pregnant, whatever, and celebrate it. And don't rag on your students when things aren't working, just encourage them. I have a sense of humor, so I like that. But, be positive with your sense of humor. Don't use it to drag people down, making snide comments at them. I really believe science is a noble calling, and that I want to impart that to my students, not, hey, I'm going to have the most funding in the department if we can get this to work. Or I'm going to have 10 papers this year. Aren't you guys happy? But, we're in agricultural sciences. Our impact on the world is really obvious to us. And, that's why we do science, even though we also do it because it's fun. And, I socialize with my students. Everybody's got their own view about that. But I don't want to be their best friends because, first of all, I may have to say things to them that they wouldn't want to hear from their best friend. And they need time away from me, to live their own life. So I value them very much, but I want to maintain that distance between me and them. This is Morgan Peltier. He got a PhD with me in about 2001. And he used to come into my office all the time and say, I've had a eureka moment. So he discovered something. And he was happy about it. And, Archimedes, the Greek philosopher, discovered buoyancy. He ran through the streets going, Eureka, Eureka, I have it, I have it. I think that's a good attitude to foster. Be excited about things in the lab. And, I celebrate probably because I like to drink. I celebrate, little successes. This is a picture we took. We had transferred, I don't know, 300 embryos in Mariana, Okeechobee, St. Lucie County in a couple months. And when we were all done, we took this picture at first magnitude with the embryo incubator, ET pipettes. And, have fun with your students if you're a fun-loving person. Like, here's a picture of me teaching students how to tie a sheep for surgery. One of my favorite pictures. I'm trying to get this in the journal Animal Science. We'll see whether they accept that. And, Francis Bacon, one of the early scientists, he wrote this, which I think is a great line. He had a lot of great lines. I would address one general admonition to all, that they consider what are the true ends of knowledge, and that they seek it, not either for pleasure of the mind, we do that, or for contention, or for superiority to others, or for profit, or fame, or power, or any of these inferior things, but for the benefit and use of life, and that they perfect and govern it in charity. I think that's a good way for us to view our lives as scientists. So I guess, my take-home message here, don't turn your grad students into this kind of person. They hated their experience, right? The grad student dropout. Spent 4 long years living wretchedly, plowed through thousands of tedious books, worked late into the night, repressed all anger, had a series of low-paying, degrading jobs, finally gave up after being unable to finish thesis, and currently unable to enjoy anything. There are people like this after grad school, and part of it's their fault, but part of it is maybe the environment they were in. So I think you should be like this Cupid here. Okay, you know what to do. Get in there and make my grad students fall in love with their research. And, I'll just end with, my major professor, Dr. Hauser. He always used to tell me, I only do science so that I can teach grad students. That's my role in life, is to teach grad students. And I used to think, yeah, I want to do science because I love science. Grad students are good, but, I want to discover things. But as I've gotten older, and these are some of my students and postdocs, we took a picture in 2020. I have come to realize that there's a lot of satisfaction to seeing your students succeed while they're with you and also afterwards. And so if you spend time thinking about it and spend time perfecting your methodology, I think it'll be a very worthwhile experience for you, and something that when you look back upon, you'll feel very proud about. So I'll leave it there.